September 1940. The skies over London darken with the thundering hum of German bombers. Beneath the heavy clouds of smoke, the streets pulse with life, a city that refuses to surrender, even as the earth trembles beneath the weight of constant aerial assault. The sound of distant explosions shatters the night, but the city, stubborn and resolute, holds fast. In the heart of this chaos, the British people cling to something more powerful than fear, their unwavering defiance. The roar of their engines fills the air, as the Royal Air Force battles against an overwhelming enemy force. Each day, each night, the struggle grows more intense, more desperate. Yet, with every passing moment, Britain's resolve hardens. In the darkest hour, with the full weight of Nazi aggression bearing down, one man, Winston Churchill, stands at the helm, offering a vision of defiance. And for all that seems lost, one truth endures: the British will not break. As the relentless air raids continue, the British people are forced to confront a terrifying question. Would they survive? Would they endure? Would they rise against the seemingly unstoppable might of the Nazis? The Second World War had been a storm gathering on the horizon for years, but by 1939, the clouds had burst. Nazi Germany, led by Adolf Hitler, had begun its ruthless expansion across Europe, disregarding borders, treaties, and the sovereignty of nations. Hitler's ambition was clear: the domination of Europe and the eradication of any who stood in his way. For Britain, it was the beginning of a new, brutal chapter in its long history of warfare. On September 1, 1939, Hitler's forces invaded Poland. 2 days later, Britain and France declared war on Germany, thus marking the official entry of Britain into the conflict. This was not the first time the world had faced a global conflict, but the scale of this war, the speed of its aggression, and the depth of its devastation were unlike anything before. The British public, still haunted by the scars of the Great War, now faced the spectre of a new struggle, one that seemed even more dire than the last. While Britain prepared for war, the rest of Europe rapidly fell under the Nazi boot. The German Wehrmacht swiftly overran Poland, and in the spring of 1940, the same military might turned westward. France, Belgium, and the Netherlands were next to fall. In just 6 weeks, the Wehrmacht executed a lightning-fast invasion, known as the Blitzkrieg, which left most of Europe under Nazi control. The British Expeditionary Force, sent to aid France, found itself cornered and trapped on the beaches of Dunkirk. In the face of near-certain destruction, the British Army embarked on one of the most remarkable evacuations in military history. Operation Dynamo, the evacuation of Dunkirk, saw over 330,000 British and Allied troops pulled from the jaws of defeat and brought back to England. But even as the soldiers returned, the news from the mainland was grim. France had capitulated, and Britain stood alone against the might of the Axis powers. The looming question was, could Britain survive? Winston Churchill had risen to the office of Prime Minister in May 1940, taking command of a nation that was already on the brink. His predecessor, Neville Chamberlain, had resigned after facing mounting pressure over his policy of appeasement, which many believed had failed to prevent the war. Churchill, in contrast, was a man of unyielding resolve. In his first address to the House of Commons, Churchill declared, "I have nothing to offer but blood, toil, tears, and sweat." It was a promise not of easy victory, but of relentless resistance. He knew that Britain could not afford to give up. The enemy might be closer than ever before, but surrender was not an option. As Hitler's forces swept across Europe, Britain found itself at a crossroads. Its traditional allies, France and Belgium, had fallen. Its once staunch defender, the Royal Navy, was the last line of defense against a German invasion. The Royal Air Force, RAF, was being called to hold the skies. The war had reached Britain's shores, and the struggle for survival had begun. In the summer of 1940, the German war machine turned its focus toward Britain. Hitler's plan, code-named Operation Sea Lion, was a detailed blueprint for invading the British Isles. However, an amphibious invasion of Britain posed immense logistical and military challenges. First, the German Navy would need to secure the English Channel, a task that seemed impossible without air superiority. Hitler's strategy was clear: to cripple the British defences through a sustained aerial campaign. The Battle of Britain had begun. For the British, the threat of invasion was a constant, growing nightmare. The Luftwaffe, Germany's formidable air force, had already inflicted devastating damage across Europe. It had decimated the Polish and French air forces, and now it turned its full attention toward Britain. The Luftwaffe, under the command of Hermann Göring, was tasked with destroying the RAF and paving the way for a German invasion. Yet, Britain was not without its defences. The Royal Air Force, though outnumbered, had the advantage of the most advanced radar technology, which allowed it to detect incoming enemy aircraft and respond quickly. The Spitfire, a powerful and agile fighter aircraft, became the symbol of Britain's resistance. These planes, along with the Hawker Hurricane, formed the backbone of Britain's defence. Pilots from across the Commonwealth, from Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa, joined the RAF in what would become one of the most iconic struggles in military history. The first phase of the Battle of Britain saw the Luftwaffe targeting British shipping and ports. However, by mid-August, the Luftwaffe had shifted its focus to the RAF's airfields, hoping to cripple Britain's ability to fight back. For several weeks, British pilots fought a bitter, exhausting battle in the skies above the Channel and southern England. The German bombers would come, often in waves, escorted by fighters, and the British had little choice but to meet them head-on. But despite the overwhelming odds, the British refused to falter. With every attack, the RAF retaliated, and the skies over Britain became a battleground of tremendous courage and sacrifice. The British public, for the most part, remained unaware of the full scale of the air battles taking place above their heads. They would only learn of it when the bombs fell, and when the sirens blared across the cities. As the summer of 1940 wore on, it became clear that the Luftwaffe had underestimated British resolve. Hitler's belief that Britain could be broken through aerial bombardment proved to be a tragic miscalculation. While Britain faced mounting losses, its morale remained unshaken, and at the heart of this resistance stood Winston Churchill, who understood that the survival of Britain depended not just on military might, but on the strength of the British spirit. As the Battle of Britain unfolded above the skies of southern England, the implications for Britain's survival could not have been clearer. Every attack by the Luftwaffe pushed the country closer to the brink, and yet the British people, under Churchill's leadership, remained resolute. The Germans had miscalculated. They had believed the sheer weight of their air assaults would break Britain's will. But the courage of the RAF and the British public was proving stronger than the Luftwaffe's bombers. Still, Britain's future hung in the balance. In Berlin, Hitler watched with frustration as his aerial assaults failed to crush the RAF. He had initially underestimated the effectiveness of Britain's air defence's radar, the quick-response fighter squadrons, and the Prussian ingenious system of communication between the radar stations and the fighters. Britain's pilots, many of whom had only recently graduated from training, were displaying extraordinary skill and courage in the face of overwhelming odds. Meanwhile, the population of Britain, including civilians who spent their nights sheltering from bombs, were learning to endure unimaginable hardships with dignity and determination. The Blitz was not just a military struggle, it was a battle of spirits. However, Germany's failure to achieve a decisive victory in the skies did not mean the threat had passed. In fact, it intensified. Hitler, increasingly desperate, altered his strategy. On September 7, 1940, the Luftwaffe launched a series of devastating attacks on London, an event that marked the beginning of the Blitz. For 57 consecutive nights, London would endure nightly bombardment. But it was not just London that faced the terror of the Luftwaffe's bombs. Cities like Coventry, Liverpool, and Birmingham would soon feel the weight of German aggression. Churchill, however, had a clear response. He knew that morale was key. A nation that loses its hope, its spirit, is already lost. He famously declared, "Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few." The few were the pilots of the RAF, who day after day took to the skies to defend their homeland. The words would be immortalized, and in many ways they encapsulated the nation's response. Britain was not simply surviving, it was fighting back, and it would not surrender. The technological innovation that helped Britain survive also played a crucial role in the battle. Radar, a seemingly simple invention, was a game-changer in the defense of Britain. Developed in the 1930s, radar allowed the British to detect incoming German aircraft from miles away, giving the RAF valuable time to scramble their fighters into the air. The Spitfire, a sleek and agile fighter aircraft, became the symbol of Britain's defiance. In the hands of skilled pilots, the Spitfire could turn the tide of air battles, providing a lifeline in the fight for survival. Meanwhile, the development of the Enigma machine and the breaking of German codes at Bletchley Park gave Britain crucial intelligence that would prove invaluable in the war ahead. Yet, despite these technological advancements, the pressure on the British people only intensified. The Luftwaffe's bombing campaign was relentless. Civilians in London and other cities spent their nights in shelters, emerging only to find their homes and livelihoods reduced to rubble. It was not only the military that was under siege, but the very heart of Britain's civilian life. The country's industrial infrastructure, vital for the war effort, was being systematically destroyed, and yet, even as bombs fell on their homes, the British people showed remarkable resolve. The phrase, "keep calm and carry on," became an unofficial motto for the nation. In the face of unprecedented destruction, there was no panic. Instead, there was only determination to keep going, no matter the cost. Across the Atlantic, in the United States, the picture was different. President Franklin D. Roosevelt had initially been hesitant to fully support Britain, as America was still recovering from the Great Depression, and the populace was divided over the prospect of entering another world war. However, as the months wore on and the conflict deepened, Roosevelt began to understand that Britain's survival was crucial for the security of the world. The United States, still officially neutral, provided crucial support to Britain through the Lend-Lease Act, which allowed Britain to receive military aid without immediate payment. This assistance, particularly in the form of aircraft and tanks, would prove invaluable in the months to come. Still, despite the help from the United States, Britain stood largely alone in the fight against Germany. Forces on the continent were formidable, and the Luftwaffe's aerial might seemed unstoppable. They had to win not just for themselves, but for the future of the world. And, with every bomb that fell, their resolve only grew stronger. The Blitz was a war on the very soul of Britain. As the Luftwaffe relentlessly bombed cities across the country, the civilian population found itself thrust into an unprecedented struggle for survival. There was no front line for civilians. Their battleground was their very homes, their streets, and their lives. London, the heart of the British Empire, bore the brunt of the bombings. For 57 consecutive nights, the city was bombarded with high-explosive bombs, incendiaries, and mines. The city's iconic skyline, filled with historic buildings, bridges, and the silhouette of St. Paul's Cathedral, became a canvas for the fires and explosions that rocked the city. But amid the destruction, London's spirit remained unbroken. People sought shelter in underground stations, basements, and makeshift bunkers. Each night, the air raid sirens would wail, and families would scatter to find safety, while those who couldn't escape watched the bombs fall, praying that they would survive. Yet, it wasn't just Londoners who endured. The people of Coventry, Birmingham, and Liverpool also faced the terror of nightly raids. Coventry, once a thriving industrial city, was all but destroyed on the night of November 14, 1940. German bombers, aiming to cripple Britain's industrial production, dropped hundreds of bombs, leveling much of the city. The sound of explosions and the roar of fires seemed to drown out all else as the city burned for days. In the face of immense loss, communities came together to rebuild, comfort each other, and carry on. In the aftermath of every raid, survivors picked through the rubble, searching for loved ones, for neighbors, for any sign of life. While entire blocks of buildings were reduced to ash, the British public displayed an extraordinary resilience, a resilience that would come to define the nation's character throughout the war. The civilians weren't the only ones bearing the weight of this war. For the soldiers, the struggle was equally harrowing, though on a different front. The men of the Royal Air Force, many still in their 20s, spent their days in the air, fighting off waves of German bombers and their escorts. They fought not just against an enemy, but against exhaustion, attrition, and their own fears. The loss of one pilot was one too many, and the RAF was forced to rotate their forces in a constant effort to keep the skies clear. Yet, the camaraderie between pilots, the unspoken bond forged in the face of death, created a fighting spirit that was almost otherworldly. The young pilots knew they might not return from their next sortie, but they flew anyway. Their courage became the stuff of legend, etched into the history of the war, inspiring not only Britain, but the world. While the human struggle was ever present, the Battle of Britain, the Royal Air Force, under the leadership of Sir Hugh Dowding, had the formidable task of defending the skies against a much larger enemy force. But despite being outnumbered, the RAF found ways to turn the tables. Central to their strategy was the use of radar, a technology that would prove revolutionary. By the summer of 1940, Britain had a chain of radar stations along its coast, connected to a central operations room. This early warning system gave the RAF precious time to scramble fighters into the air before enemy bombers even arrived. It was a game-changer. The radar network allowed British forces to respond with startling speed, using a combination of aircraft tactics and defensive formations to repel the enemy. The Spitfire, with its agile design and powerful armament, became the weapon of choice for the RAF. This aircraft, already renowned for its performance, was at the forefront of Britain's defense efforts. The Spitfire was not just a symbol of air superiority, it was a symbol of hope. For every enemy bomber it brought down, the British public felt a renewed sense of confidence. Each dogfight fought above the skies of England became a testament to the resilience of the RAF. At sea, The Royal Navy was equally vital to Britain's survival. With Germany controlling much of Europe's coastline, the Royal Navy faced the constant threat of German U-boats and surface ships. The Battle of the Atlantic, waged for the control of vital shipping lanes, would drag on throughout the war. But in 1940, Britain's naval forces stood as the last line of defense against a possible German invasion. The Royal Navy was called upon to secure the Channel and ensure that any attempt to invade Britain would be met with fierce resistance. The effectiveness of the RAF and the Royal Navy was amplified by their integration. Together, these forces created a multi-layered defense system that was hard for the Luftwaffe to break. This synergy, combining air superiority with naval control of the sea, helped protect Britain's shores and prevent a successful invasion. Technology played a crucial role in Britain's ability to hold back the German onslaught. While the Luftwaffe possessed an overwhelming numerical advantage in aircraft, Britain's technological superiority proved to be a vital counterbalance. Radar, the invention that had once been mocked as a futile experiment, proved to be one of the most important breakthroughs in military history. The British radar system, known as Chain Home, allowed the RAF to detect incoming German aircraft long before they reached the coast. This allowed Britain's fighter pilots to be waiting for them, ready to engage in battle. It was a technological advantage that saved countless lives and turned the tide in the Battle of Britain. The Spitfire, too, was a technological marvel. Designed by R.J. Mitchell, this aircraft was fast, maneuverable, and lethal. The Spitfire was the perfect answer to the Luftwaffe's bombers and fighters. In the hands of skilled pilots, it became the spearhead of Britain's defense. It was not just a tool of war, it was a symbol of Britain's ability to innovate and overcome adversity. In the shadows of the battle, another technological breakthrough was quietly unfolding at Bletchley Park. There, a group of brilliant mathematicians and cryptanalysts, led by Alan Turing, worked tirelessly to crack the German Enigma code. The Enigma machine, used by the Germans to encrypt their communications, had been considered unbreakable. But through ingenuity and determination, the British cracked the code, providing vital intelligence that would shape the course of the war. This intelligence, passed on to RAF commanders and Allied forces, helped turn the tide of several key battles. At the heart of Britain's survival during the darkest days of 1940 was the unyielding leadership of Winston Churchill. When he became Prime Minister in May, Britain had already endured significant losses, and the situation was dire. In his first speeches, Churchill demonstrated a clear-eyed understanding of the war's realities, but also a deep belief in Britain's capacity to prevail. It was Churchill's resolve, his determination not to yield, that inspired the nation to stand firm in the face of almost certain defeat. Churchill's speeches during the Battle of Britain have gone down in history as some of the most powerful and galvanizing words ever spoken. His famous address to the House of Commons, in which he declared, "Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few," captured the essence of the British war effort. He knew the stakes. Britain stood alone against the Nazi threat, and it was a fight for its very survival. Churchill's rhetorical genius, his ability to inspire through words, was instrumental in maintaining the morale of the British public. His leadership transcended the battlefield. It infused the entire nation with a sense of purpose. Even as cities burned, Churchill's unwavering faith in victory carried the nation forward. Churchill was not the only leader shaping the British war effort. On the battlefield, General Bernard Montgomery, later known as Monty, also played a pivotal role in inspiring confidence. Montgomery's leadership in North Africa and later in Europe would be crucial to Britain's military successes. But in the early stages of the war, Montgomery's role was less about direct command and more about instilling the right spirit. His belief in discipline, preparedness, and bold action would serve as a model for British commanders and troops in the years to come. Montgomery's focus on morale, the mental toughness required to survive and overcome the odds, was an essential element of British strategy. The soldiers, many of whom had witnessed the horrors of the First World War or the early battles of the Second, needed someone to show them that victory was possible. Montgomery provided that leadership, blending personal resolve with tactical skill. His leadership would later prove invaluable, most notably during the campaigns in North Africa and in the Normandy landings. As the Luftwaffe's bombers rained destruction upon Britain, the British people were forced to make a choice: to buckle under the pressure of overwhelming odds, or to stand tall and continue the fight, no matter the cost. This moral stance, a refusal to yield to tyranny, became the defining characteristic of Britain's war effort. The daily struggle of civilians to continue their lives amidst constant aerial bombardment is a testament to this indomitable spirit. Women worked in factories, producing war materials for the front lines. Men served in the Home Guard, guarding their streets, ever watchful for invasion. And in the shelters, amid the noise of explosions and the fear of death, ordinary Britons clung to one belief: to give in would be to allow the Nazis to rule not only Britain, but the world. This was a fight for freedom, democracy, and the very ideals that Britain held dear. The bombing raids, though devastating, did not break the British people. Instead, they strengthened their resolve. The Blitz, with its horrific losses, became a crucible in which the strength of Britain's moral fibre was tested and proven. In a time of unimaginable hardship, the British did not turn inward. They rallied to the cause. The determination to fight on, to not allow the Nazis to bring Britain to its knees, became the moral backbone of the war effort. This moral fortitude was not limited to the British Isles alone. The Commonwealth stood with Britain in its darkest hours. Thousands of men from across the Empire enlisted in the Royal Air Force, the Royal Navy, and the Army, forming an unbroken chain of resistance against the Axis powers. From Canada to Australia, the British Commonwealth's involvement was crucial, not only in manpower, but in strengthening the moral resolve that was essential for victory. From the outset of the conflict, the German High Command had underestimated the resolve of the British people. They believed that Britain, isolated and facing a far superior force, would quickly capitulate. Hitler's initial strategy was based on the assumption that Britain would seek peace negotiations after suffering a few blows. Fact, some of the German generals, notably Hermann Göring, thought that a quick and devastating aerial bombardment would shatter British morale. As the Battle of Britain raged on, the Germans became increasingly baffled by the British refusal to break. Despite the loss of aircraft, the relentless bombing raids, and the mounting civilian casualties, in fact, Churchill's speeches inspired not only the British people, but also the international community. Hitler, who had expected a swift victory, found himself facing an enemy that was not only determined, but capable of repelling the most intense aerial assault in military history. The Luftwaffe's miscalculation was in its underestimation of Britain's ability to adapt. The Germans had superior numbers, but Britain had the resolve. The RAF, although outnumbered in aircraft, had the superior tactics, technology, and spirit to fight back. This misperception would ultimately cost Germany dearly, as it forced Hitler to abandon his plans for an invasion. As the Battle of Britain reached its zenith, it became clear that Britain would not yield. By the summer of 1940, the fate of Britain had become inextricably linked to the skies above. The Luftwaffe, under the command of Hermann Göring, had thrown everything it had at Briton bombers, fighters, and relentless assaults on civilian targets. The Battle of Britain was now entering its most critical phase. Hitler, desperate to break the spirit of the British people and pave the way for a German invasion, had issued orders for an all-out campaign. But, on the other side of the Channel, Britain's resolve was hardening, as every day, every hour, was a fight for survival. August 13, 1940, marked the beginning of what the Germans called Adlerangriff, or Eagle Attack. This operation was designed to destroy the Royal Air Force in a series of well-coordinated attacks on British airfields and radar installations. The Luftwaffe initially targeted airfields and fighter bases in southern England, hoping to cripple Britain's ability to respond. The first week of August saw heavy losses on both sides, but the RAF's ability to regroup and respond quickly proved critical. The radar system, which the Luftwaffe had underestimated, allowed Britain to intercept incoming German raids. The Spitfires and Hurricanes soared into the sky in ever-increasing numbers, defying the odds. The enemy was met head-on, and the skies above Britain became a deadly battleground. German bombers, despite their numbers, found themselves constantly harassed by British fighters, unable to carry out their missions without suffering heavy casualties. But it wasn't just the RAF that was under assault. Civilians across Britain were enduring daily bombings that shattered their homes and their peace. London was particularly targeted. On September 7, 1940, Hitler shifted tactics, ordering the Luftwaffe to carry out an all-out attack on London itself, rather than just RAF bases. The city, already reeling from the bombardment of its industrial centers, now faced waves of German bombers, dropping high explosives and incendiaries. For London, it was the beginning of what would become the most devastating period of the Blitz. For the next several weeks, night after night, German bombers would roar over the city, releasing their deadly payloads. Buildings collapsed, fires raged, and the city seemed to burn with no end in sight. Yet, amid the chaos, the British people did not falter. They continued to seek shelter, continued to dig through the rubble, continued to fight back. But, despite the massive destruction, the Luftwaffe could not break the British spirit. The battle in the skies intensified as German bombers came to London, only to find themselves engaged by British fighters. The RAF pilots, with their ever-increasing experience and skill that fell on London, fueled the British determination to keep fighting, to hold on. As the Luftwaffe's focus shifted more towards London, the strategic mistake of focusing on bombing civilian targets rather than RAF airfields became evident. Hitler's plan to break Britain through relentless bombing had failed to achieve its goal. The Luftwaffe had begun to suffer significant losses. While the Germans continued their attacks on British cities, they were losing too many aircraft to keep up the pressure. The RAF, though still outnumbered, had successfully destroyed a considerable portion of the German bomber fleet, and their fighters were able to keep the enemy at bay. The balance of the skies had begun to shift. As the Luftwaffe realized they could not maintain their offensive against a relentless enemy. On September 15, 1940, a day that would be etched into British memory, the battle reached its apex. In what would become known as Battle of Britain Day, the Luftwaffe launched their largest and most concentrated attack yet, targeting London. This was to be the final push that would either break Britain or end the threat of invasion. The skies were filled with German bombers, accompanied by fighters, as they descended upon London. The RAF responded with every available fighter, and a series of fierce dogfights erupted above the city. The sky seemed to burn with tracer fire as Spitfires and Hurricanes tore into German formations. In the midst of the chaos, something remarkable happened. The British air defences held firm. The Luftwaffe's bombers, despite their numbers, were no match for the speed, agility, and tenacity of the British fighters. The German losses were catastrophic. By the end of the day, over 50 German aircraft had been shot down, and the RAF had achieved one of its most decisive victories of the battle. For the first time in the Battle of Britain, the Luftwaffe had been decisively beaten in the air. The German pilots, exhausted from weeks of sustained combat, had begun to lose their will to fight. The psychological toll on the Luftwaffe was immense, as they realized they could not defeat the RAF through sheer force alone. Churchill's words, spoken just a few days earlier, now seemed prophetic. The brave pilots of the RAF had turned the tide of the battle, and with it, the fate of Britain. For Hitler, the dream of Operation Sea Lion, a German invasion of Britain, began to fade. Britain, though battered, would not break. From that moment on, the Luftwaffe was forced to reconsider its strategy. The bombing raids continued, but the hopes of a successful invasion had been dashed. The Battle of Britain had been won not just in the skies above, but in the hearts and minds of the British people. The enemy had underestimated Britain's resolve, and now Britain had proven that it would not yield. The Battle of Britain was more than just a military victory. It was a profound, psychological, and strategic turning point in the Second World War. By the time the Luftwaffe abandoned its effort to break Britain, the immediate effects of the battle had already begun to shape the course of the war. The RAF had successfully defended Britain's skies, preventing a German invasion and preserving Britain as a vital base for the Allies. The toll on both sides had been immense. The British had lost over 500 aircraft and approximately 900 airmen. The Germans, in comparison, had lost more than 1,700 aircraft and hundreds of pilots, many of whom were highly trained and experienced. These losses would not be easily replaced. The Luftwaffe, despite its numerical superiority, was left severely weakened. The campaign proved to be unsustainable. The Germans, realizing they could not win the war through aerial bombardment alone, began to shift their focus. The cost in human lives was not limited to the airmen. Civilian casualties were high as well. Over 40,000 British civilians were killed in the Blitz, and hundreds of thousands were left homeless. Cities like London, Coventry, and Liverpool bore the scars of the relentless bombing campaigns. Yet, despite the devastation, the resilience of the British people was unwavering. They refused to allow the destruction to crush their spirit. The Blitz had united the country in a common cause, and this unity would prove to be one of Britain's greatest strengths in the years to come. On the military front, Britain's survival in the Battle of Britain had a profound effect on the strategic calculations of the Axis powers. Hitler, who had hoped to conquer Britain and force a peace settlement, now realized that Britain would not be an easy target. The threat of invasion had been neutralized. The success of the RAF was not just a military victory. It was a statement to the world that Britain would continue to fight. For the Allies, this was a crucial morale boost. It proved that Hitler could be beaten, that victory was possible even against overwhelming odds. For Churchill, the victory in the Battle of Britain was a validation of his leadership. His unyielding stance in the face of Nazi aggression had inspired the nation to hold firm. After the battle, he addressed the British public, famously stating, "What General Weygand called the Battle of France is over. I expect that the Battle of Britain is about to begin. But, in truth, the Battle of Britain had already begun and ended in Britain's favour. The victory in the Battle of Britain had far-reaching consequences for the wider war effort. For one, it meant that Britain could continue to serve as the primary base for the Allied forces in the European theatre. As the United States began to provide more substantial support through the Lend-Lease Act, Britain was in a better position to coordinate and prepare for future operations. The Battle of Britain demonstrated that, despite the losses it had sustained, Britain was far from finished. The battle also demonstrated the power of technological innovation in warfare. The combination of radar, advanced aircraft like the Spitfire and Hurricane, and the code-breaking efforts at Bletchley Park had given Britain the edge it needed to survive. The Allies, particularly the United States, took note of these innovations. Over the next several years, these technological advancements would play a pivotal role in turning the tide of the war on multiple fronts. In Germany, the failure of Operation Sea Lion and the inability to crush Britain were serious blows to Nazi morale. Hitler had pinned much of his hopes on Britain's capitulation. Instead, the German war machine found itself bogged down, forced to shift its focus elsewhere. The Luftwaffe would be unable to recover its strength in time to affect the war's outcome significantly, while Hitler's invasion plans were thrown into disarray. The Battle of Britain also helped to solidify the alliance between Britain and the United States. Roosevelt, although initially hesitant to commit fully to Britain's cause, now saw the importance of supporting Britain as a key ally in the fight against fascism. The victory also solidified Churchill's position on the world stage as a leader capable of withstanding the greatest of odds. His leadership would inspire not just Britain, but many across the world, as he continued to rally the forces of democracy and liberty against the Axis. Perhaps most importantly, the Battle of Britain marked a turning point in the perception of the war. Up until that moment, the war had been a string of defeats for the Allies. But the Battle of Britain showed that the Nazis were not invincible. It was the first significant defeat that Hitler's forces had suffered, and it provided the Allies with the confidence they needed to continue their fight. The battle proved that, even when faced with overwhelming odds, victory was still possible. As the war raged on, the British continued to hold their ground. The Battle of Britain had not been the end of the conflict, far from it, but it had been a decisive moment, a victory that marked the beginning of the eventual downfall of Nazi Germany. Britain had stood firm, and in doing so, it had not only secured its own future, but had paved the way for the eventual Allied victory in Europe. In the aftermath of the Battle of Britain, the British people had demonstrated something far greater than military strength. They had shown an unbreakable spirit, a fierce resolve that refused to yield in the face of adversity. The victory in the skies above the British Isles was not merely a military triumph, it was a symbol of defiance, a testament to the power of the human will in the most desperate of times. For Britain, the Battle of Britain represented more than survival. It was a moment when the fate of the nation and of the free world hung in the balance, and the courage to face that peril head-on became the defining characteristic of the war effort. The sense of unity forged in the heat of the Blitz and the unwavering leadership of figures like Churchill helped Britain endure when all seemed lost. As history looks back on this moment, it is clear that the Battle of Britain was not just a turning point in the war. It was the moment when tyranny was first defeated in the skies, when a nation united in its determination to resist, and when the world began to see the true power of resolve in the face of evil. The Battle of Britain was, at its core, a battle not just for the survival of a nation, but for the survival of freedom and liberty. And in that victory, Britain's legacy was sealed, not as a nation that surrendered in the face of darkness, but as one that chose, with every ounce of its being, to rise above the storm.